Hey everybody. So let's see, today I dug up a bunch of maps and other examples of regions and things that have moved around or changed around to give us some more examples of how all this works. Just starting out with a couple of reminders of some of our key terms that we'll be using today and in many future classes. We're talking about culture, we're talking about material and non-material. Material obviously being stuff, non-material culture being, well, things that are usually passed down person to person. So when we look at history, very often the only things that we can find are material culture, are art things. Like that's often all that's left of ancient societies because the people have dispersed and very often there wasn't written communication. Folk culture versus popular culture. Folk culture is the older kind of traditional. Popular culture is the kind of global culture we're often talking about. Indigenous culture, very often tied with our thoughts of folk culture, but they don't always overlap. We'll give you some more examples of that as we go. And just a reminder, subculture, there's all kinds of subcultures. These are just cultures that they can be part of popular culture, but they're usually like a smaller subsect. So some folk culture survival regions in the U.S. As you can see, there's actually quite a few different folk regions in the U.S. of populations that have, are very often under pressure to assimilate into kind of a larger American culture. One kind of note, Germanic, as in from Germany, as a kind of folk culture in the U.S. has been one that has more largely assimilated through time. This was especially true in the early to mid 20th century. A lot of people who had German heritage just fully assimilated into American culture. People know why that was for German culture, kind of uniquely to like super assimilate? In the 20th century, we had a couple big wars with them, right? And that was during and shortly after those wars. A lot of people who had German heritage very quickly just dropped those cultural artifacts and adopted. Instead of Frankfurter, we started calling them hot dogs, right? All these different things that used to be more tied to German culture were given up. But these different folk cultures, we could see them on the landscapes. Some of the most identifiable landscapes are memorials or grave sites and whatnot because, well, those are moments of time, right? And they're usually made at a time that someone dies and usually are not changed through time. And again, just a reminder about some of the terms. We talk about placelessness. Placelessness is, it's part of that globalization and kind of a global culture, right? We can think of chains, popular music, and then remember these things we think of as kind of the opposite of indigenous cultural regions. And we're looking at a lot of different regions in the U.S. And like I said, I looked up some maps of some more examples. When we were talking about before in the South and why Florida is kind of mixed when it comes to identification with the South, you have a whole bunch of people who are there just because they're retirees and don't have any other kind of cultural connections to the region. You can kind of see that displayed pretty well on this map. A map of fast food sales and Fast food global chains are another example of popular culture. And it's interesting that the map overlaps with some of the very distinctive kind of folk culture regions within the United States. And that means that there's kind of a conflict there, right? I think we went over this map already before. When it comes to vernacular regions, if you remember, we're kind of looking through maps and just trying to guesstimate what some different regions would be made and called. As you can see, we fit into what is commonly considered the Midwest, although our state is kind of more divided than maybe you would realize as far as how the vernacular definition changes. This is, college students were asked to identify the Midwest, and as you can see, our state was pretty solidly identified in that area. But some people thought Texas was, or I don't know what state the people who thought Texas was the Midwest came from, but not the area that I would go. Mobility and diffusion of all these different things, right? We're going to talk about the diffusion of a couple different things. Sometimes things come about not because of diffusion, but because of independent invention that are similar in different areas of the world, right? So everything isn't always diffusion. Diffusion of the rodeo. As you can see, the geography of something like the rodeo aligns pretty well with definitions of what the West would be, right? If we were going to say, where do rodeos happen? You might think, well, Texas. But that's not the only place, right? It's more of a Western thing. Plenty that are in other states. Map of blowgun diffusion, and we know that these were independent inventions in different places around the world because they were at a time when people were not in communication with each other all over the world. These were in ancient times, right? But there's something about the blowgun that just kind of comes to mind when people are playing around with sticks and whatnot. So not all things are diffused. So interestingly, although when we think about indigenous cultures around the world, we think about cultures that aren't global, right? They're very often kind of fighting globalization in their own ways. Yet at the same time, the new technologies that there are available help indigenous populations branch out around the world and have actually helped them fight for a number of different preservation causes. This chapter specifically talks about, an effort at the World Trade Organization, who has annual meetings, big annual meetings that you could imagine those would be sites of big protests. If someone is feeling like, very often the feeling is that world trade is coming in and intervening in a local economy. So indigenous populations, very often they have subsistence economies where they grow enough food and make enough products for themselves. And if you have kind of competing goods coming in, that could disrupt that system, right? And so the other thing is, indigenous populations very often live in areas that are very biodiverse, right? Like if you could picture a rainforest and an indigenous community living in there. And so in a weird way, we kind of rely on indigenous communities to protect those resources, because a lot of them are like the rainforest, like they give oxygen to the whole world, right? Or lots of different biodiversity. There are some of the kind of more vulnerable populations in the world, and so reliance on them for this type of protection isn't really equal to how much they are being compensated for that type of protection, right? Because they're really mostly not being compensated. Well, at this protest, they were able to use a global platform because this was an international organization event that was going on. And they were able to kind of get out the word, and a number of non-governmental organizations kind of came to their aid. A picture from the book. I'm not going to do these questions. So there's a section in this chapter talking about nature culture and how people's view of nature are different kind of depending on where they're from, right? It's kind of interesting actually because, well, if you're someone who's from the city, you work in the city and you're going to go out to the woods for a hike, right? You'll go out to those woods and you'll see nature as kind of its own defined entity as it is, right? People who actually live in these types of areas, they tend to see these as resources, right? So sometimes if you maybe visit a relative who lives way out in a rural area, very often they don't have in mind preservation, right? They have in mind utilizing these resources, right? So a bunch of trees they might see as a finished product that they could kind of make their living off of. Actually, I already said this stuff, sorry. Yeah, I already talked about this stuff. Well, I guess I didn't really say about how biotech companies are, of course, very interested in places that have a high level of biodiversity, because they're always looking for cures for diseases and all kinds of ways that biological systems do things that we might want, but out of those contexts. And again, how these overlap of the indigenous populations and high biological diversity, right? Term in this chapter, Indigenous technical knowledge. Indigenous technical knowledge. What that means is that usually people who live in an environment know it much better than someone who doesn't live in that environment, right? So this is a way that well, people in these very different landscapes, since they know how to use the things that exist there, whether it be vegetation or whatever there is in the landscape, well, since they know how to use those things, if international companies come in and kind of take that knowledge without any kind of compensation, it's kind of a form of theft, right? I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, an example of how there's conflict between kind of globalized cultures and some local indigenous cultures. As I said, often something like farming is a sustainable level and usually subsistence, meaning again, you hunt and gather enough for your populations and not enough to like sell or anything, right? Usually indigenous populations aren't as much part of kind of the capitalism game of trying to make money from their products. They're just providing for their families and for their community, right? Well, if their area that they get these resources from, so hunting and gathering, well, if you're hunting, right? In this case, it was turtles. If you have a certain amount that you need for your family, and then you have a company coming in that has the best modern equipment, and they could actually get a lot more of the turtles than people using indigenous methods could get. Well, then you had the population who, as the turtle population became more and more sparse, they had to spend more and more time finding less and less turtles, right? And so that's one of the examples of direct conflict. There was also very often in these instances, there's pressure on the locals to partake in the larger kind of global economy and hunt to sell rather than hunt to provide sustenance for themselves. But that very often runs into a conflict of, well, how much money can you get for what you've hunted? How much food can that buy as a replacement for the food that you're trying to get? Well, in this example from the book, there was a number of protests and whatnot, and they were actually able to get the government to move in and protect some of the areas that had been hunting. Support from non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which will come up a lot as we're talking about geography, because NGOs are, well, one of the types of organizations that does help Indigenous communities. All right, more nature culture stuff, folk ecology. Well, as I said, people who live in a place usually know how that stuff interacts, right? And in the examples from the text, they look at specific ecological, right? Meaning farming and hunting and gathering, but also using resources in a region that you live in, right? Because through generations you just get to know your environment, right? Especially if you have a community and the people who have stayed in an area. And very often these things can be lost if a population has to move for whatever reason, right? Because, well, all that knowledge is very place-based, right? If you're talking about something like medicinal herbs, right? Things that could be used for treatment for various illnesses. Well, if you have a community who live in a place for a long time, they may know the ins and outs of every type of herb that there is. If they're forced to move, well, there's a lot of different things that can happen, right? Very often they'll attempt to move to a place that has a similar ecology to where they're from, right? So there can be the most overlap as possible. And they will often also attempt to bring some of those resources with them. So plants and obviously animals, and we saw a lot of that in the documentary. We saw the Guns, Germs, and Steel, of people bringing the knowledge that they had from their locality to the new places. Hopefully, like I said, the places are not that different. Oh, here's the map I was looking for. And this is a picture from our book of some relocation of some Appalachia people, right? Southern Hill folk. And well, there's a number of different reasons populations have to move. Very often, folk cultures, when they are moving, very often it's literally because the land that they have wasn't technically owned by them, that they lived on. And someone will become a new property owner and will just literally evict populations, and they'll need to find a new place to live, right? If you're living out in a forest in this case, in the southern U.S., and you're using all the local resources to sustain yourself, well, if you're kicked off that actual land, you've got to think through a new strategy. This chapter, when we're talking about nature culture, also talks about gendered differences when it comes to nature. This comes about because in many different places around the world, if you remember from our documentary we watched the gathering of resources is often divided by gender, and you'll have the males doing more of the hunting and the women doing more of the gathering. Well, go over all these points. This chapter also talks about how, well, when we talk about people adapting technologies to their local circumstances. Example was used of mountain biking, because, well, today, like, people know what mountain bikes are. They're a pretty common thing. In the early day of bikes, um, you know, the very early bikes often didn't even have like inflated rubber tires. They were really made for city smooth streets. If you've ever ridden a bike with a tire that goes flat, you know that it could be quite uncomfortable. They used to have more of a springy seat to try to make up for that before they started using inflatable tires. But even the inflatable tires of most bikes, because they're made for streets, that type of thing is minimum. Um, when people try to use bikes in more rugged terrain, it just very often didn't work. Very laborious, had all kinds of problems. Well, the first things that we would call mountain bikes were adaptations that people cobbled together from local parts, and they didn't quite look like the standard mountain bike as they are today. I would say, if anything, it looked more like maybe like more like a tractor bike, because it was used. They used tractor parts, right, to try to make it more sturdy and hardy for well, not always literally roads, but uneven terrain. Um, Another example from the book, well, the change of farming technology to match different types of soils. In this case, well, Florida, even if you have areas where you will drain a swamp or a wetland, the land will often still not be as dry as something, say, in the Midwest. So you need to adapt your technology for that locality. Ecofeminism, another concept in this book, again, connecting with the whole gender discussion. But ecofeminism is a well, as it says, it's a standpoint that asserts that as childbearers, gardeners, and gatherers, women are more in touch with nature and better stewards of the earth. A lot of stuff written with ecofeminism uh, really also looks at, very often it will talk about how when it comes to hunting and gathering, the women's side of that equation has much more of a focus on sustainability. Um, and very often when it comes to global pressures and pressure to start taking part of an international economy and selling goods rather than just making goods to provide for your community, it's often the men who will be the ones who are a part of that. And so those pressures, when you talk about globalization pressures, are often gendered in those specific communities. That's one of the reasons why when we saw the photos of protesters and whatnot, set in the Wayback Machine, right, it's mostly women in this case, right? Not all, but tends to be the ones who are being the spearheads of these different movements. Have I lost where I'm going? All right. This isn't to say that these are roles that people have to take. Geographers aren't going to say that, well, women should feel this way or men and women should interact in this way. They're just saying these are ways that they do interact, and so it's of note. So agroforestry. Agroforestry is considered something of a compromise between kind of sustainable practices, but also taking part in a larger global economy. Because, well, in the past, most forestry has just involved clear cutting of forests, which is not very sustainable, especially, well, if you have an ecosystem that has a mixture of trees and other things, especially say in the rainforests. If you cut down the trees in the rainforest, there's enough rain that, well, the roots will die, and you could have entire landscapes get washed away because rainforests get lots of rain, right? It's right there in the name. So again, as I said before, men and women, especially in Indigenous especially in folk culture, tend to take very different roles when it comes to interacting with their environments. Let's see. I feel like I already said this stuff, but just to reiterate a little bit, when it comes to gender and agroforestry. Well, most of the movements to preserve the forests were led by women. Yeah, that's a good summary of that one, I guess. Okay, keep on going. Oh yeah, there's a section in here that talks about animal geography, and I feel like Guns, Germs, and Steel actually did a fair amount of introducing to the concept of animal geography. But animal geography is exactly what it sounds like. In the field of geography, if you remember, we talk about larger forces that constrain people, that people have to interact in those forces. And so one of the examples that they used is, well, dogs, right? And the breeding of dogs, right? And so thus, dogs' existence and their actual makeup was part of breeding, was a big part of it, right? So there was outside powerful actors in that. But even here, the text and geographers like to point out, well, there's also actual individual agency. Dogs also took part of creating a relationship with humans. There are some who have even suggested that to some extent our pets have also domesticated us. Like I said, could have a whole big debate about that. All right, so when it comes to the aspect of our cultural landscapes, especially, well, these are examples in North America, folk houses, right? Folk houses that have been, well, they're geographically distinct, right? And you have lots of different styles. Very often when people think of older folk housing in the US, they'll think of something like the old traditional log cabin, right, with actual logs. But most is, well, not that kind of rough. Most has lots of different distinctive features, kind of depending on the type of work that was done in the different areas and the type of populations who would be living in these different areas. Next thing, let's switch track a little bit. All right. I feel like, I don't know if I told you guys, but I think I did. We had these regular meetings and these study sessions on students and how long students can pay attention to a lecture. Did I already tell you this? There's only a certain amount of time students can pay attention when you're lecturing away, so we try to break it up and to do different things. Do you know how long the average student can pay attention in a lecture? Want to make a guess?
15 minutes.
That's a great guess. 13 minutes. 13 minutes. So y'all have been paying attention twice that. So what I'm gonna do, gonna have us break up into small groups. Looks like with how many students are here today, it could probably just be 2 groups. But I want you to get in some groups and I want you to look at these questions and kind of debate it. We'll do this for like just 10-ish minutes. And then we'll come back to the bigger group and kind of talk these things through and see what people thought. All right? All right. Self-assemble.